The first thing you need to understand is that nobody goes to Kelvora by choice. That's not me being dramatic. That's just the truth of it. Kelvora is what happens when a planet decides it doesn't want visitors. The atmosphere alone will kill you in 17 minutes if your suit fails. The temperature at the equator, the warmest part of the planet, sits at -83 degrees Celsius on a good day. The poles are so cold that the instruments we brought from the Confederation Survey Corps stopped working the moment we entered low orbit, and our chief engineer, a four-armed Dravan named Tessic, had to recalibrate everything twice before we could even attempt a descent. But we went anyway, because that's what Survey Corps does. We go to the places that tell you to leave. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 31 years old when we landed on Kelvora. I was a geological mapper, one of 6 humans on a crew of 22 representing 9 different species from across the Galactic Confederation. My job was simple, at least on paper: map the surface formations, catalog mineral compositions, file reports, go home. Simple, right? We landed in what our orbital scans called a stable ice shelf region, which in practice meant a place where the ground wasn't actively trying to crack open and swallow our ship. The Ardent Star, a mid-class survey vessel, beaten up, reliable, smelling permanently of whatever Grethack food the Helorian cook was making on any given day, touched down with a shudder and a grinding protest from the landing struts that made everyone grab something. Captain Yenna Solaris, a tall Miacadian woman with silver-blue skin and the patience of a mountain, looked around the bridge calmly. "Struts held," she said. "Barely," said Tessic from his station. "Barely counts." She stood up and started pulling on her thermal oversuit. "Prep your teams. We have a 6-hour surface window before the storm system from the northern shelf reaches us." 6 hours, on a planet that wanted us dead. Standard Tuesday for Survey Corps. I remember stepping out of the Ardent Star for the first time and just stopping. There's no other word for it. I stopped walking. I stopped thinking. I just stood there on the boarding ramp with cold air hissing against my visor and stared. Kelvora is beautiful. I know that sounds insane given everything I just told you, but it is. It genuinely, heartbreakingly is. The ice shelf we'd landed on stretched out in every direction like something that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be a landscape or a dream. The surface wasn't flat, it rose and dipped in long, slow waves like the planet had once been an ocean and then just frozen mid-breath. The color was wrong in the most extraordinary way. Ice should be white or maybe blue. Kelvora's ice was deep green at the surface and shifted to a dark, almost violet shade the deeper it went. In the low light of Kelvora's dim orange sun, the whole shelf glowed. My suit's thermal reader told me it was -91. My eyes told me I was looking at the most extraordinary thing I'd ever seen. "Voss," that was Corporal Denham Hale, our team security officer, appearing at my shoulder. Denham was also human, ex-military, broad shoulders, the kind of person who made you feel safer just by being near them. "You planning on standing there all day?" "Give me a second." "We have 6 hours. Seconds are currency." I pulled myself together and followed him down the ramp. There were 4 of us in my ground team. Me, Denham, a Helorian xenobiologist named Krav whose long neck and triple-jointed limbs made her look perpetually like she was about to fall over but never did, and a young Confederation cadet named Avrin, a Sylvani, pale and four-eyed, on his first official survey mission, and trying very hard not to show how nervous he was. We were assigned the eastern section of the shelf. The orbital scans had flagged some anomalous density readings there, something in the ice that was heavier than it should be, clustered in a rough formation about 2 kilometers from landing. Could be mineral deposits, could be a subsurface structure, could be nothing. It was a kilometer walk before Krav slowed down. Her neck swiveled in that unsettling triple-joint way that meant she was paying serious attention to something. Helorians have extraordinary vision, 4 spectrum ranges, including thermal and ultraviolet. Where I saw ice and shadow, she saw things I couldn't even imagine. Krav, I said. There is something, she said very quietly. In the formation ahead, something large. Denham's hand moved to the sidearm at his hip. Old habit. Define large, he said. She was quiet for a moment. When a Helorian goes quiet, you learn to wait. They're not being dramatic. They're processing something complex. Krav's 4 eyes swept the formation ahead slowly, and her neck tilted at an angle that meant she was switching between spectrum ranges. Very large, she said finally. The formation was, it's hard to describe it. Even now, years later, it's hard to find words that don't sound like I'm making things up. Imagine a glacier. Enormous, slow, ancient. The kind of glacier that has existed on a planet since before your entire civilization learned to make fire. Now imagine that the glacier has a shape that isn't quite random. Most ice formations look random. Wind and pressure and time make chaotic things. Beautiful things, but chaotic. This wasn't chaotic. The way the ice rose from the shelf, the way it curved and swept back, the long ridges running along it, the way certain portions tapered into points and others rounded into mass. It was too consistent to be accident. But it was enormous. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It wasn't the size of a car or a building or even a ship. The formation was at least 200 meters long and perhaps 60 or 70 meters at its highest point. A mass of dark green-violet ice rising from the shelf like a sleeping hill. Geological anomaly, Avrin said, because he was reading from the scanner in his hand and he needed something concrete to say. Heavy composition, density inconsistent with standard Kelvoran shelf ice. He paused. There's something inside. We know, Krav said. No, he looked up from the scanner. His 4 eyes were wide. I mean something structured. The density pattern inside this formation, it's not mineral, it's organic. None of us said anything. The wind moved across the shelf. A low, thin howl that the suit's external audio translated into something that sounded almost mournful. Organic, Denham repeated. Organic, Avrin confirmed. We stood there in the cold, looking at the enormous shape in the ice, and I thought about how on every planet Survey Corps has ever catalogued, in every corner of the Confederation's reach, we have never, not once, encountered anything larger than a microorganism on a world with these temperature conditions. Never. I should have called it in immediately. I know that. I know that's the protocol. Anomalous readings go straight to the captain. You don't investigate without backup. You don't approach without authorization. I called it in. Captain Yenna answered immediately, and I gave her our coordinates and our readings, and she said she was dispatching a second team. And then while we waited, Krav walked forward. Krav. I am not touching it, she said without looking back. I am looking. I followed her. Denham said something under his breath about protocols and followed too. Avrin hesitated for exactly 4 seconds and then came after us. Up close, the formation was even more unsettling. Up close you could see things that the distance had blurred. The ridges running along the surface were too regular, too deliberate. They had a spacing to them, a rhythm that wasn't geological. And the surface of the ice itself, where I'd expected it to be rough, weathered, blasted by Kelvora's vicious wind, it was smooth. Not perfectly smooth. There were cracks and inclusions, but underneath those, the surface had a texture that wasn't ice-formed. It was almost like scales, like something that had been covered by ice gradually over time rather than something ice had created. Krav stopped about 3 meters from the base of the formation and stood very still. Ilara, she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before, a kind of careful flatness that meant she was controlling herself. Yeah, I am looking at a living organism. I looked at her, then at the formation, then back at her. Krav. Its metabolic output is near zero, somewhere between hibernation and complete suspension. But there is cellular activity in here. She turned to look at me, and her four eyes were steady and serious. This formation is not a geological anomaly. Whatever is inside this ice is alive. The wind moved again, the low howl. And that's when I saw it. You know how sometimes your brain registers something before the rest of you catches up? Like your eyes have already understood what they're looking at, but your mind is still 3 steps behind, trying to catch up, trying to find the right file for what you're experiencing. That happened. I was looking at the surface of the formation, at that almost scaled texture, and my eyes moved along it, following the ridge lines, tracing the shape, and then my eyes arrived at something and stopped. And my brain arrived 3 seconds later and said, that is an eye. Not a metaphor, not a geological feature that resembled an eye, an actual eye. Enormous, perhaps 2 meters across at its widest, set into the formation at an angle that had been facing roughly away from us. A slight shift in my perspective as I'd moved slightly around the formation had brought it into view. It was covered in ice, clouded, thick, layered ice built up over what must have been an extraordinary amount of time. But through the ice, through the green-violet translucence, I could see the shape beneath, the lid, the structure, the geometry of an eye designed to see things on a scale I could barely imagine. It was closed. It was closed, and had clearly been closed for a very long time, and ice had grown over it, and ice had grown over all of it, and whatever this was had been lying here on Kelvora in the cold and the dark for so long that the planet had begun to absorb it. Oh, I said. That was all just oh. Denham was beside me. I heard the sharp inhale through his suit comm. Is that? Yes, I said. That's a. Yes. That's an eye. I know. Captain Yenna's second team arrived 17 minutes later. That's how long we stood there in the cold, looking at it. Krav had continued her scan. Ovrin had gone very quiet and was transmitting data back to the ship. Denham had positioned himself between us and the formation without really thinking about it, which is just the kind of person Denham was. You could put him on a beach on a vacation planet, and he'd still orient himself to protect whoever was nearby. Yenna herself came with the second team. That surprised me. Captains don't typically come on ground assessments, but I suppose living organism of unknown size frozen in a glacier was the kind of briefing that makes you want to see for yourself. She stood next to me and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then, how old? We can't be certain, Krav said. Ice accumulation rate suggests a minimum of 20,000 years, possibly significantly more. Metabolic activity. Near zero but present. Whatever is in there is not dead. Yenna looked at the formation for another long moment. Her silver-blue face was very calm. That was one of the things about Yenna. She was the calmest person I'd ever met in crisis situations, and I'd always thought that was a skill, a practiced thing, until I watched her look at a 20,000-year-old sleeping creature frozen in a glacier, and I realized it wasn't skill. It was just genuinely who she was. Some people are made for the unimaginable. Yenna Solaris was one of them. Right, she said. We're not touching it. We're not scanning it with anything more aggressive than passive readers. We are going to document, measure, and report this up the chain, and we are not going to do anything stupid. Is that understood? It was understood. We set up a perimeter camp about 50 meters from the formation. Temporary prefab shelters, monitoring equipment, passive scan arrays. The storm system the captain had mentioned arrived on schedule, but was milder than predicted, a steady, howling wind, and a scattering of crystalline precipitation that sounded like broken glass against the shelter walls, but nothing that threatened our setup. The monitoring data started coming in over the next few hours. And it kept getting stranger. Krav had been right about the metabolic activity, but as our instruments settled in and calibrated to the specific thermal and chemical signatures of the formation, the readings became more detailed. The cellular activity wasn't uniform. It was concentrated. There were clusters of denser activity, points in the formation where something was happening at a higher rate than elsewhere. And those clusters were positioned in patterns that, as Avrin quietly pointed out while we were reviewing the data that evening, corresponded to what you might expect if you were mapping the nervous system of a very large vertebrate. "You're saying it has a nervous system," I said. "I'm saying the activity clusters match where you'd expect a nervous system to be in a creature of this general body plan." He pulled up the scan overlay on his display and rotated it. "Look, here, and here. These are, if this is the head region, this would be a brain-adjacent structure. And these running along the dorsal length, spinal analog." I looked at the overlay for a long time. "Avrin," I said. "Yes. What's the scale on this?" He adjusted it. The overlay, showing the estimated full extent of the organism inside the ice, didn't fit neatly on his display. He had to scroll. It was not 200 meters long. Our initial estimate had been based on what was visible above the shelf surface. What Avrin's scan was showing was that the formation continued below the surface, considerably below. The ice shelf at this location was, according to our depth readings, approximately 400 meters deep. The organism nearly reached the bottom. I called my family that night. We had a communication relay through the ardent star, and the lag was bad. It always was this far out, but I needed to hear my daughter's voice. She was 8. Her name was Myra. I'd been gone for 7 weeks at that point, and she had her father's talent for making you feel guilty without actually saying anything guilty, just by being herself, happy and curious and slightly annoyed that I wasn't home yet. "When are you coming back?" she asked. "Soon, Bug. You always say soon. Because it's always true, eventually." She asked me what I was looking at out there, and I almost told her. I almost said, "Myra, you will not believe what we found today." But I stopped myself because I didn't know enough yet. I didn't know what we'd found. I knew we'd found something, and that something was extraordinary, but I didn't have a shape for it yet. And I didn't want to give Myra a half-formed wonder when I could give her the full one later. "Ice," I said. "Lots of beautiful ice." "That sounds boring." "It sounds boring, but it isn't." "Okay," she said, with the particular tone of an 8-year-old who has decided to believe you against their better judgment. "Okay, come home soon." "I will, Bug." The Confederation response to our preliminary report arrived on the 3rd day. I say arrived, but what I mean is it crashed down on us from about 6 levels above our operational capacity in the form of 3 simultaneous transmissions. One from Survey Corps Regional Command, one from the Confederation Science Directorate, and one that Yenna received privately and didn't tell us the origin of, but which caused her to close her communications alcove for 40 minutes and emerge looking exactly the same as always, which somehow made it more unsettling. The gist of Regional Command's transmission was, "Do not disturb, do not approach closer than current perimeter, await specialist team, ETA 9 days. The gist of the Science Directorate's transmission was, "Collect all available passive data, do not disturb, do not approach closer than current perimeter. This may be the most significant xenobiological discovery in Confederation history. Please maintain your current course of action. A specialist team is being dispatched. ETA 9 days. The gist of what Yenna emerged from her alcove to tell us was, "We're staying 9 days on Kelvora." I want to be honest about those 9 days, because I think it matters for understanding what came after. They were quiet, they were cold, they were extraordinary. When you spend 9 days sitting 50 meters from something you cannot explain, you go through stages. The first day or two are pure adrenaline, everything is heightened, everyone is hypervigilant, You keep checking the monitors as if you expect the readings to change dramatically at any moment. By the third day, the adrenaline has burned off and you're left with something quieter and harder to name. By the fifth day, you've started to feel something that's almost comfortable. Not safe. Kelvora was never safe, but familiar with the presence of the thing, the way you get familiar with a mountain or a river. It's there. It's been there for 20,000 years. You've been there for 5 days. You're a footnote to whatever story this is. By the seventh day, I started talking to it. Not loudly, not in a way I wanted anyone to hear. I'd go to the edge of our perimeter in the morning, when the light from Kelvora's orange sun hit the formation at a low angle and turned it into something that looked like dark stained glass, and I'd stand there with my coffee going cold in the insulated cup I always forgot to close properly, and I'd just talk. I talked about Myra, about the way she'd looked at the ocean on our last trip to Earth's coast before I deployed, that same kind of arrested wonder, standing at the waterline with her shoes getting wet, not caring, just staring at something larger than herself. I talked about the job, about Survey Corps and what it meant and why I'd chosen it, which was a question I'd been avoiding for a while because the honest answer was complicated and involved a failed relationship and a need to be moving, always moving, and I wasn't ready to sit with that. I don't know why I talked to it. It was unconscious, maybe sleeping, maybe something so different from anything I understood that sleeping and unconscious didn't even apply. But there's something about a thing that has been waiting for 20,000 years that makes you want to say something. The specialist team arrived on day 9, as promised. They arrived in 3 ships. I didn't recognize the lead vessel's configuration. It wasn't a standard Survey Corps ship. It was sleeker, darker, with markings I didn't know. The other 2 I recognized as Confederation Science Directorate vessels, standard research configuration. What I wasn't expecting was who climbed off the lead vessel. His name was Commander Vex Drallin, a Gorathi, which meant he was tall, gray-skinned, compound eyes, an extra set of limbs folded against his midsection that served as fine manipulators. Gorathi are one of the founding species of the Confederation. They've been spacefaring for 9,000 years. They have a quality that humans have sometimes described as arrogance, but I think it's more accurate to call it certainty. They are certain of things in a way that can be magnificent and can be catastrophic depending on the circumstances. Drallin walked across the ice shelf toward the formation with his team, 12 individuals, mix of species, all carrying equipment I didn't recognize, and he looked at it for about 3 seconds. "It's smaller than the reports indicated," he said. "With respect, Commander," Yenna said, "the organism extends well below the surface. The full length is estimated at nearly 400 meters. I know what the report said." He didn't look at her. "Your team is relieved. Please confine yourselves to your vessel pending debriefing." Yenna looked at him with that mountain patience expression of hers. "My team's 9 days of monitoring data has been received and reviewed. Thank you, Captain." Now he looked at her. Compound eyes are strange. You can't read a Gorathi the way you read a human, but there was something in the set of his body, the angle of his folded limbs, that communicated dismissal as clearly as any expression. "That will be all." We were confined to the Ardent Star for 6 hours. I spent most of that time in the common area, pretending to review data on my tablet and actually watching through the viewport as Drallin's team worked around the formation. They'd set up their own equipment, much more sophisticated than ours, from what I could see. At one point, they deployed what looked like a series of projectors arranged in a circle around the entire formation, and for about 20 minutes there was a faint shimmer in the air around it, some kind of field. I didn't know what it was. Krav came to sit beside me. "What are they doing?" I asked. "I think," she said slowly, "that they are trying to wake it up." I turned to look at her. "You can't know that." "I cannot know that," she agreed. "But the field they have deployed, the frequency range, It is a stimulation array, used in xenobiology to trigger response states in dormant organisms. Her neck tilted, scaled up considerably from any version I have seen used before. Why would they want to wake it up? Krav was quiet for a moment. The better question, she said, is whether they have considered what happens if they succeed. 6 hours became 12. 12 became 18. We weren't confined anymore. Dralen's team had stopped actively blocking our movements, but there was a clear social pressure to stay out of the way. Yenna, to her credit, pushed back on that. She walked to the formation site on the morning of the second day and had a conversation with Dralen that I wasn't close enough to hear, but that ended with her returning with marginally more information. They know what it is, she told us, gathered in the Ardent Star's briefing room. The room went quiet. They've seen something like it before, Denham asked. Not exactly, but the Gorathi Science Archive has records, ancient records pre-Confederation, pre-spaceflight from the early years of Gorathi astronomy. She paused, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. There are accounts of a species. No name in our languages. The records use a symbol that doesn't translate. A very old species, pre-galactic possibly. They were recorded as being of extraordinary size and another pause. Extraordinary capability. The records are incomplete, fragmentary. They were assumed to be mythological. Assumed, Avrin said. Yes, Yenna looked at us all. Assumed. Denham leaned back in his chair. So that thing out there may be the only living specimen of a species that the oldest civilization currently in the Confederation thought was a legend. The room was very quiet for a moment. That's what Dralen's here for, I said. Yes. And he wants to wake it up. Yenna looked at me steadily. The Science Directorate wants a communication attempt. Dralen is their field commander. Has anyone asked, I said, what this thing was doing before it went asleep for 20,000 years? Because things don't just go to sleep in glaciers. Something happened to it. Something put it here. And we have no idea what it is or what it wants or... I stopped, took a breath. Has anyone considered that waking it up might be a problem? I raised those concerns, Yenna said. And Commander Dralen informed me that the Confederation Science Directorate has been waiting for evidence of this species' existence for 400 years, and that operational caution was well within the parameters of. That's not an answer. No, she said, it isn't. On the morning of the third day after Dralen's arrival, something changed. I don't know exactly what they did the night before. I was in my bunk, in that half-awake state that passes for sleep on a survey mission, when I heard Krav's voice on the shipcom. All personnel, external monitoring now. I don't know how she was still awake or what she'd been watching, but I pulled on my suit and ran to the boarding ramp with everyone else, and we came out onto the ice shelf in the thin pre-dawn light, and I understood immediately why she'd called. The formation was different. It looked the same from a distance. The same shape, the same dark green-violet mass rising from the shelf. But close enough that the early light caught it properly, you could see that the surface had changed. The ice had always had a particular quality, a particular stillness. The stillness that very old things have. That stillness was gone. The ice was moving. Not dramatically. Not cracking or shifting or collapsing, but the surface had a faint, slow, almost imperceptible movement, like breathing, like something beneath the surface was expanding and contracting at a rate so slow you'd miss it if you blinked. But I didn't blink. I stood there and I watched it and I counted the seconds between the swells, 14 seconds, and I thought, that's a breath. That's one breath every 14 seconds. Something was breathing. Dralen was already at the formation site. I could see him and his team. They were not panicking. They were moving in the coordinated, controlled way of people who have a protocol for this, who have planned for this. But Krav was very still beside me. And Krav, I had learned, was only very still when she was afraid. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of that slow, deep breathing, that 14-second rhythm, while Dralen's team ran their equipment and transmitted data and had urgent, quiet conversations that we were too far away to hear. The light shifted as the orange sun climbed higher. The formation caught it differently than before. The ice seemed less opaque, as if the warming of whatever was inside had changed the crystalline structure slightly, let more light through. And then I saw the eye move. Not open, not yet, but the lid, that enormous shape I'd traced on the first day, the shape my brain had needed 3 seconds to catch up to, the lid moved. A slow, incremental shift. Like the first flicker of motion in someone waking from a very deep sleep. The ice around it cracked in 3 places, small splits running out from the lid's edge, and from those cracks came a faint mist, not frozen water. Something else, something warmer. "Dralen," Yenna said on the open comm. "Commander Dralen, you need to hear me." His response was clipped, professional. "Captain Solaris, please maintain your perimeter. Your stimulation array, if that's what triggered this, you need to understand that you don't know how this organism will respond to waking in unfamiliar circumstances. You have no behavioral data, no threat assessment. We have the situation in hand." "Commander, we have the situation in hand." The lid moved again. What happens when something that has been asleep for 20,000 years opens its eyes? I've thought about it a lot since. I've tried to understand it from a biological perspective, from a physical perspective, from the perspective of what it must be like to be that thing, to go to sleep on a world and wake up to find a cluster of small, suit-covered creatures standing around you with machines you don't recognize. But here's the thing about understanding. Understanding takes time. And the eye opened in about 4 seconds. One moment it was a lid barely moving, crusted with ice, slow. And then it opened. Not the way a human eye opens, with that gradual, uncertain reveal. It opened the way a fault line releases. A sudden shift. Ice cascaded from the lid in a shower of dark green-violet shards. The mist intensified. A sound came from the formation, not a roar, not a crash, but a sound that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. A subsonic pressure that came through the ice shelf itself and traveled up through the soles of my boots and into my bones. And the eye was open. It was extraordinary. I can try to describe it. The iris, if that's the right word, was a deep, luminous amber, shot through with streaks of something darker, almost red. Not animal amber, not that flat, reflective animal shine. This had depth to it. Layers. Looking into it was like looking into a very dark lake that had light in it from some source you couldn't identify. The pupil was a vertical slit that must have been 15 meters long. The eye looked at the sky first, just the sky, for a long moment, as if reacquainting itself with the concept. Then it looked down. At us. Dralen's team held. I'll give them that. Trained professionals, all of them, and they stood their ground and kept their equipment running even when the eye swung toward them and the pressure in the air around the formation changed. A subtle thing, like the drop before a storm, that you felt in your sinuses and your teeth. I was 50 meters away, and I couldn't have moved if I'd tried. Not from fear, from something else, something I don't have a clean name for. Have you ever been looked at by something so large that the looking itself was a physical experience? The eye was oriented toward Dralen's team, but it was large enough, and I was close enough that I was in its peripheral field. I could feel it, not metaphorically. Something about the quality of that gaze, something about being in the visual field of an organism that old and that large, registered in my body as pressure, as weight. Krav had gripped my arm. Denham had stepped in front of me. Avrin was absolutely not breathing. The eye moved slowly across Dralen's team, back and forth, taking inventory maybe, processing, 20,000 years of sleep, and you wake up to find a ring of creatures pointing machines at you. I don't know what went through whatever passed for its mind in those moments. But then it did something none of us were prepared for. It looked at me. Not at my team. Not at the general area near the ship. At me specifically. The pupil, that enormous vertical slit, rotated slightly, and the angle of the eye shifted, and I know how this sounds. I know there's no scientific reason it should have been looking at me rather than the nearest cluster of beings. I know the scale of it made individual targeting seem absurd. But it looked at me. And something happened that I haven't told many people about. Because what happened was, I remembered every conversation I'd had with it over the previous 9 days. Every morning at the perimeter's edge with my cold coffee. Every word I'd said into the freezing air. Everything I'd told it about Myra and the ocean and the way my daughter stood in the water not caring about her shoes. And I thought it heard me. Then the second eye opened. The ice shelf doesn't behave simply when something 300 to 400 meters long begins to move within it. The math of that becomes violently apparent very quickly. The first crack appeared about 30 meters north of the formation, a line running across the surface that opened with a sound like a gunshot and then kept going, branching, spreading. Steam, actual steam, not just mist, was rising from the formation now in thick columns that caught the low orange sun and turned gold. The formation was shedding ice in large sections as what was beneath it began to expand, to move, to shrug off 20,000 years of accumulated weight. Fall back, Yenna on the comm, her voice absolutely level. All teams fall back to the ship, now. Dralen's team was already moving. To their credit, to their very considerable credit, they were moving in good order, pulling their equipment with them, keeping comm channels open. Dralen himself was the last of his team to retreat, and he was watching the formation over his shoulder with an expression I couldn't read from my distance, but that read to me from his posture as something between terror and awe. We ran. The ice shelf cracked 3 more times while we ran. Each crack sent a shiver through the ground underfoot, not destabilizing, not enough to knock us down, but enough to make every step a question. Krav ran in her strange, efficient, triple-jointed way that looked wrong but was faster than it seemed. Avrin ran with the desperate energy of someone whose body has overruled their mind. Denham ran with one hand out to the side, subtly prepared to catch any of us who stumbled. I ran looking back over my shoulder. Because I couldn't not look. The emergence took 40 minutes. 40 minutes from the first crack in the shelf, ice to the full emergence of the organism from the glacier. I watched most of it from the Ardent Star's observation deck, pressed against the viewport with about 15 other people, all of us silent. The ones who'd been outside were still in their suits. Nobody had thought to take them off. Nobody was thinking about much except what was happening on the ice. The shape that emerged from the ice was like nothing I can describe by reference to anything you've seen, because there is nothing you've seen that it resembles. Not adequately. People will make comparisons, will reach for the nearest available frame, and I understand why, because the mind needs somewhere to put a thing before it can process it. But here is what I saw. 4 limbs. Enormous, jointed, ending in structures that might have been analogous to claws or to hands. It was hard to say. The limb joints were armored in something that wasn't quite scales and wasn't quite plates but was somewhere between, overlapping, deep green-black, that same dark shifted color as the ice they'd been embedded in for so long. A neck long and articulated that moved with a controlled fluidity inconsistent with its mass. A head that was, the head is the hardest part, elongated, heavy at the brow, with those 2 amber eyes now both open and catching the orange light of Kelvera's sun. Structures along the jaw line that might have been sensory organs, or might have been something else entirely. And this is the part that rewrites everything, along the back, running from the shoulder region to the base of a long tail that was still partially embedded in the ice. Folded structures. long and jointed and folded against the body the way a bird's wings fold. Wings, the thing that had been frozen in Kelvora's ice for 20,000 years, had wings. It stood on the ice shelf in the light of the alien sun and breathed. That's all. For a long time, long enough that I became aware I'd been holding my own breath and let it out. It simply stood there and breathed. The subsonic pressure of its breathing was something we could feel even through the hull of the ship. The steam from its body, warmth differential between it and the brutal Kelvoran air, rose and curled and caught the light. It looked at the sky. It looked at the star, Kelvora's orange sun, small and distant but present. It looked at our ships. The ardent star is, by the standards of the vessels we were looking at, not a small ship. 112 meters, standard survey configuration. Dralen's lead vessel was somewhat larger. The science ships were comparable to the ardent star. The creature on the ice shelf looked at all three of them, and I had the very distinct impression that what we looked like to it was something between small and irrelevant. Not threatening, not impressive, just present, unexpected, things that had not been here before. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. And then slowly, the creature turned its head. Toward the ardent star. Toward, more specifically, the section of the ardent star where the observation deck viewport was. And the amber eye, even at this distance, enormous, luminous, found the viewport. Found me. Yenna's voice came on the ship-wide comm. This is Captain Solaris. I'm going to attempt first contact. Standard protocols. Everyone stay calm and stay at their stations. First contact protocol, for those who don't know, involves a series of mathematical and spectral signals transmitted on a broad frequency range, designed to establish a baseline for communication with an unknown intelligence. It was developed centuries ago and refined through about 30 actual applications. It's considered the gold standard. She transmitted. The creature on the ice shelf watched the ardent star. Then it made a sound. Not in response to the transmission, or maybe in response. It's impossible to know. But the sound it made, felt rather than heard, traveling through the ship's hull, resonating in the walls and the floor and the air, was complex. It wasn't a single tone. It was layered. Multiple frequencies simultaneously. Some in ranges our instruments caught, and some in ranges they didn't. Harmonics interlacing in patterns that our communications officer spent the next 8 months trying to decode. What our communications officer eventually concluded, which is now a fairly significant paper in the field of xenolinguistics, is that the sound was not random. It had structure. It had repetition. It had the hallmarks of language, not a language we knew, not a language we could begin to decode in the field that day, but language in the abstract sense of being a system that encodes information. It was speaking. Dralen's voice came on our comm channel. Captain Solaris, I'm requesting authority to deploy the full communication array. We have translation matrices loaded from the Gorathi archives. Commander, Yenna said, with respect, you had operational authority for the stimulation array. Communication decisions go through the Confederation Joint Command structure, which at this location means it goes through me. A pause. Captain, we proceed with standard first contact, standard pace, standard protocols. We have an unknown intelligence of unknown temperament and we will not rush it. Is that clear? Another pause, longer. Clear, Dralen said. What followed was 2 hours of the most extraordinary and most frustrating experience of my professional life. First contact at standard protocol pace is an exercise in patience. You establish the signal, you wait for response, you analyze the response. You modify and retransmit. You wait again. The idea is that you build a foundation before you build anything else. It takes time. It is designed to take time. The creature on the ice shelf was apparently also patient. It responded to every signal transmission. Not always quickly. Sometimes there was a wait of several minutes, but it responded. And the responses had the right shape. They reflected and modified elements of what we'd sent in ways that suggested processing, analysis, the beginnings of a feedback loop. The second hour, Avrin, who turned out to have a remarkable talent for pattern recognition that his cadet training hadn't fully developed yet, called out something in the response data. "There's a repeating element," he said. "Look here, here, and here. Different contexts, different transmission sequences, but this particular pattern appears in each response. It's not random." Krav leaned over to look at his display. Her neck did the processing tilt. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I think," Avrin said carefully, "it might be a name." We didn't decode the language. Not that day. Not that week. The 8 months of xenolinguistic work that followed, involving teams from 7 Confederation universities, and a level of academic collaboration that my colleague Dr. Pereth called the single most complex interdisciplinary puzzle in recorded science, eventually produced a partial functional dictionary and a set of grammatical structures that allowed for extremely basic, heavily caveated communication. But that day on the ice shelf, something simpler happened. Something that didn't require a dictionary. The creature had been standing on the shelf for about 2 hours. Our transmissions had been going back and forth. And then, without any obvious trigger, without any signal from us, it moved. Not aggressively, not toward the ships. It moved to the edge of the ice shelf, where the glacier met what on Kelvora passes for open ground, a vast, flat expanse of frozen rock, scoured bare by wind, stretching away from the shelf in the direction of what our maps called the northern lowlands. And it turned to face us one more time. Those amber eyes, both of them, catching the light. And then it unfolded its wings. I have to try to explain what this looked like. The wings, folded against its back, had not looked their full size. Nothing about a folded wing communicates its scope until it opens. The creature spread them slowly, not all at once, but in stages, each joint extending, the membrane between pulling taut and the shadow that fell across the ice shelf as they came to full extension, covered all 3 of our ships. All 3 ships. The wingspan was, our later calculations put it at somewhere between 400 and 500 meters, tip to tip. The membrane was dark, shot through with fine structures in a pattern that looked, from a distance, almost like the branching of rivers seen from a great height. In the light of Kelvora's sun, those structures caught the light and held it, so the wings didn't look opaque. They looked like enormous stained glass windows. Dark, magnificent, improbable. It held the wings extended for a moment. Just a moment. Looking at us. And I thought, standing there with my hand against the cold viewport, looking at something that had been in the ice since before my species invented agriculture, I thought, this is what the Gorathi ancestors saw. This is what they wrote down in records that their civilization eventually decided were myths. This is what they saw and couldn't explain, and so they called it a story. And now it was standing on an ice shelf in the light of an orange sun, looking at 3 small ships carrying a collection of species it had never encountered, and we were looking back at it, and nobody had any idea what came next. That's the thing about a moment of genuine first contact. You don't know what comes next. You can't. No protocol covers it. No training reaches it. You are just present, alive and present in an unrepeatable moment, looking at something that is looking back. The wings beat once. The shockwave of displaced air hit our ships like a physical blow. Everyone grabbed something. Loose objects slid. The ardent star groaned. And when I got back to the viewport, the creature was already in the air. Already higher than the ship. Already in the orange sky of Kelvora, shrinking, climbing. Those enormous wings working in great slow sweeps that looked unhurried and carried it upward at a speed that our instruments clocked at roughly 400 kilometers per hour. It climbed into the sky of Kelvora and didn't look back. It climbed through the outer atmosphere. And then our tracking systems, every passive sensor we had, lost it. Gone. We stayed on Kelvora for another 11 days, while Dralen's team gathered data and Yenna filed 14 separate reports, and the Confederation Science Directorate sent 3 increasingly urgent transmissions asking for clarity on what exactly had occurred. Krav collected ice samples from the formation, from what was now an enormous empty depression in the shelf, the shape of the cavity it had left behind telling us more about its anatomy than anything we'd directly observed. Avrin spent the time working with the communication data. I mapped the depression. On the 6th day after its departure, I went back to the edge of the formation. The empty cavity in the ice. I stood there with my cold coffee, and I looked at the shape of the absence it had left, and I thought about 20,000 years, about sleeping in the dark and the cold and the silence, about what it takes to sleep that long and wake up and find the world completely unrecognizable and still, extend your wings and choose to go. I thought about Myra standing at the ocean's edge. I called her that night. "You said you'd tell me what you found," she said immediately, because she was 8 and had been waiting. "I know." So, I thought about how to say it, about what words would work for an 8-year-old for this. "You know how sometimes," I said, "something seems impossible until it isn't." "Like what?" "Like, you know, when you couldn't ride your bike without the training wheels, and then one day you could, and you couldn't remember why it had seemed impossible." "Yeah. It's like that, but bigger." "How much bigger?" I looked out the viewport at the dark sky above Kelvora, at the stars visible through the thin atmosphere, at the distant orange glow of the sun setting on the ice shelf. "A lot bigger, Bug," I said. "I'll tell you the whole thing when I get home." Dralen found me at the formation edge the day before we broke camp. He came and stood next to me, and we both looked at the cavity in the ice for a while. He wasn't what I'd thought he was. He was more complicated. The certainty I'd read as arrogance was real, but so was something underneath it. The kind of feeling you see in people who have wanted something for a very long time and then gotten it, and found that the getting of it has rearranged everything they thought they knew. "The stimulation array," he said finally. "You think we shouldn't have used it?" "I think it woke up when it was ready to wake up," I said. "I think we just gave it a reason to choose now rather than later." He was quiet. "The Gorathi records," he said. "The ones we found it in. The symbol they used for this species, the one that doesn't translate." He paused. "The closest approximation in terms of meaning is something like the first or the ancient ones. Or, and this is the translation that the archivists favor, the ones who were here before." I looked at the empty cavity in the ice, at the shape of what had been here, patient and cold and alive, while civilizations rose and reached the stars and built confederations and sent survey ships to cold planets. "Before everything?" I asked. "Before us," he said, "all of us." The last morning on Kelvora, before we boarded the Ardent Star for the long journey back, I went to the formation site one more time. The cavity was already different. Ice moves slowly, but it moves. The edges had softened. The extreme cold was beginning the long work of filling in the space, or erasing the record of it, the way water fills a footprint on a beach. By the time anyone comes back to Kelvora, if anyone comes back to Kelvora, there may be nothing to see. Just ice, deep green-violet ice, beautiful and cold under an orange sun. I stood there and I didn't say anything this time. I'd said everything I had to say over the 9 days of waiting, and what came after was beyond language anyway. Or beyond my language. Beyond any language we currently have. I just looked. And then I went home. 3 years later, on a survey mission to a binary star system about 40 light-years from Kelvora, a Confederation long-range sensor array registered an anomalous reading. A large object, traveling at well above standard interstellar transit speeds, in a region of space where nothing large was supposed to be. The object did not transmit, did not respond to signals. The sensor reading lasted 11 seconds before the object moved out of the array's range. The object's mass estimate, which was flagged as uncertain due to the brief contact window, was consistent with an organism of approximately 300 to 400 meters in length. The Confederation Science Directorate added the reading to a growing file. The file has a classification header. The header uses a Gorathi symbol that doesn't have a clean translation. The closest approximation is the ones who were here before. Myra is 11 now. She knows the whole story I told her in pieces over the years since Kelvora. She asks questions about it, smart questions, the kind that make me realize she's going to be better at this than I am. Last week she asked me something I didn't expect. Do you think it remembers you? I thought about it, really thought about it. I don't know, I said. I don't know if remembering means the same thing to it that it means to us. But you talked to it, she said, for 9 days. I talked at it. Mom, she gave me the look that means she thinks I'm being deliberately obtuse. You talked to it, and it looked at you. Specifically at you. She'd heard this part of the story many times. That's not nothing. No, I said, it's not nothing. So maybe it remembers. I looked at her, at my daughter, who has her father's way of making things simple without making them smaller. 11 years old, sitting at our kitchen table in our apartment, with the window behind her showing a gray autumn sky. Maybe it does, I said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. And I thought about an amber eye, enormous and luminous, and layered like a deep lake with light in it. I thought about wings that covered 3 ships. I thought about a cavity in the ice, slowly filling, slowly being erased. And I thought, somewhere out there between the stars, something that was alive before we were anything is still moving. And maybe, just maybe, it carries with it the small, warm memory of a human voice in the cold. Talking about a little girl standing at the ocean's edge. Not caring about her shoes. Just watching something larger than herself.